Our next speaker provides us with years of experience and passion and expertise in the federal government, leading the United States' global efforts to combat human trafficking and also to support the coordination of anti-trafficking efforts across the country. Please join me in welcoming to Greenville, South Carolina, John Cotton Richmond, Ambassador at Large for the U.S. Department of State's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. Welcome, Ambassador Richmond.
It is wonderful to be here with you all this morning, if for no other reason than you got me out of Washington, D.C. Thank you. What a toxic place that can be. Honestly, Washington, D.C. is like a city full of senior class presidents. It's like everyone you didn't like in high school moved to the same city at the same time. So I'm really grateful to get to be back here. Grateful for your leadership here. Getting to watch them early this morning as they were preparing, the spirit that they had, the interest that they had about this issue was really, really meaningful. Grateful for all the people who are joining online in my home state of Virginia, at the Eastern Virginia Medical College, at hospitals all over, as well as Ireland. I'm particularly grateful for this idea that communities of faith can be involved in this issue of human trafficking. I'm looking forward in October to being at the Vatican. Women religious will be there as they begin to think even more deeply about this issue. But I think I should probably start with just trying to explain what my role is. You might be wondering why in the world the United States has an ambassador at large, or even what an ambassador at large is. My family and friends are still confused. They keep waiting for me to move to another country. They're like, where are you supposed to be? Because when we think about ambassadors, we think about ambassadors in residence, an ambassador to a specific place on a wide variety of topics. But the United States also has 6 ambassadors at large, which are not ambassadors to a specific place, but to all places, and not on all issues, but on one issue. And I'm incredibly grateful that the United States has elevated the issue of trafficking in persons to that status. I can also tell you that the title that they have given me is ridiculously long. It's 30 words with 3 conjunctions. You should know that in Washington, there is an inverse relationship between the length of your title and the amount of influence you wield. Part of leading the State Department's Office of Trafficking in Persons is we get to mobilize the U.S. foreign policy in our global efforts to engage the world on how we can combat trafficking in persons, how we can work to end human trafficking. We do that through all sorts of engagement. We do it around the 3P paradigm that you may be familiar with. That is prosecution, protection, and prevention. And these really are 3 strands of the same cord. They're all important. They're inextricably intertwined. One of the things I'm incredibly grateful for is the team of people, these expert analysts that fan out across the globe, working to identify practices that can help countries improve their response in accordance with their own domestic laws as well as our international treaties. But we should probably back up a step and just define what human trafficking is. And here's the nut of the definition, the heart of it, is human trafficking is compelling someone to work or to engage in a commercial sex act. If you want later, I'd be happy to walk through the UN protocol and its definition, or the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and its definition, but it all boils down to compelling someone to work or engage in a commercial sex act. Which means that human trafficking is broader than just sex trafficking. It includes labor trafficking. It includes U.S. citizens as well as non-U.S. citizen victims. It makes sure that we understand that this is not a crime about the movement of people. That's human smuggling. If you Googled news reports about human trafficking, half the articles would actually be about human smuggling. There is absolutely nothing in international or U.S. domestic law that suggests that someone has to be moved across a border from one jurisdiction to another in order to be trafficked. I honestly wish we could just go back in time and delete the word trafficking from the definition or the term at all, because it makes me think about road congestion, not the coercion of people. And so I would encourage you just to think about how this is a crime of coercion and not a crime of movement. To that end, the International Labor Organization has helped us understand that traffickers, they're exploiting 77% of their victims in the victim's country of origin. They're never moving across a border. I think most countries try to think about this as a transnational crime, but it's also a domestic crime. For many years, we used this idea of origin, transit, and destination countries. I think we're moving away from that because it perpetuates this myth of movement. So I want to be able to think about that. I want to be able to think about this idea of what trafficking is, and then lead us into a discussion where we can think about the 3 Ps, but 1 P in particular. Most of the healthcare workers are going to be involved in the P of protection. That is identifying victims and making sure that they can get the services they need. Stunningly, researchers have told us that 77% of the victims in the United States that have been identified, 77% had some sort of contact with healthcare services during their victimization. So we know that healthcare providers and workers are going to encounter victims in the course of their work. And yet we also know that only 13% of healthcare workers, when they were surveyed, said that they felt empowered to identify victims when they met them. So as we think about this P of protection, I'd like to frame it around 3 questions. The first is, why do we protect? The second is, what are we protecting victims from? And then the third is, how can we do this better? Why, what, and how? Well, the first question, why do we protect? Just think about why you protect things. Why do you decide that something is worth your effort to protect, whether it's your valuables, your things, your family, your friends? You always choose to protect something because you believe that it has value. You believe that it has some sort of inherent value that would require you to spend your resources or even put yourself in harm's way in order to care for something. You protect because you have value, and that's why we are in this work. A few years ago, I had the privilege of spending some time with Barry Black, who is the chaplain of the United States Senate. We were in his beautiful office overlooking the Washington Mall, and he turned to me as we were talking about trafficking, and he stopped and he said, "John, the value of an object is determined by what someone is willing to pay for it." And then he paused. And his words just sort of hung in the air. It sounded very similar to what I might have heard in my macroeconomics class from college. The value of an object is determined by what someone is willing to pay for it. But traffickers use that exact idea in order to coerce individuals. They're constantly telling their victims that they do not matter. They're constantly telling their victims that they have no value, that their opinions don't matter. They remind them of this every day. Perhaps one particularly officious way that they do this is through changing names. Those of you who work with victims on a regular basis know this to be true. Traffickers almost always try to change the name of their victims. It may start sort of harmlessly through a playful nickname, or it may be much harsher than that. Because a name represents your identity. It was given to you by people that love you. And when they take that away, they're changing who you are. If you think about it, the miniseries Roots that was popular in the 1970s and has recently come back was premised on this very plot turn. That is, the slave that had been brought here from Africa, his name was Kunta Kinte, and his slave owner wanted to change his name to Toby. And over again, beating after beating, it was all because he would not accept this new name, Toby. Because changing someone's name snuffs out that last flicker of hope. And traffickers want to do that over and over again. But we get to flip the script on what traffickers do. We get to say that people do matter, that they do have value, that they are worthy. We do that over and over again. Traffickers also try to communicate this idea of no value just through their torrent of lies, constantly telling individuals that their self-worth, their identity is wrapped up in the worst things that were done to them or the bad decisions that they've made. That their performance or that their abuse defines who they are. They say, you're an addict, you're illegal, you're a criminal now. They use these labeling identification terms in order to dehumanize their victims. They literally weaponize these statements. The people of goodwill, we get to combat this. We get to protect survivors by declaring they're valuable. A few weeks ago, I was in London. I watched as a group of 4 survivors came into Buckingham Palace, and they met with members of the royal family. And I was thought for a moment how beautiful it is that these people are being brought into this wonderful place. They're being called by their name. They're being asked their opinions. They're being listened to. All the things the trafficker said would never happen. Their identity, their value is being affirmed. We protect survivors because they matter, because they have inherent value. Or as one of my favorite authors puts it, we protect everybody, always. Who do we love? We love everybody, always. And this may seem obvious. It may seem so obvious that it's not necessary to say that people have dignity, that people have inherent value. But the survivors I meet, they tell me they can't hear it enough. And I think we need to anchor ourselves to this why if we're going to be successful at thinking through the what and the how. So, what are we protecting victims from? Perhaps the most obvious answer is we're protecting victims from their trafficker. As we have to restrain the traffickers. We have to hold them accountable. And there's been a stunning and notable decrease in prosecutions of traffickers around the globe. Many traffickers operate with impunity, with absolutely no sense of risk or fear that anyone will ever hold them accountable for their crimes. We must make sure that they are detained pre-trial and not given bail in order for their victims to feel stabilized. We have to make sure that survivors aren't worried that their traffickers will carry out threats against their family members or their friends or make good on their threats of coercion. We have to simply protect victims from their traffickers. We also actually need to protect victims while their traffickers are being held accountable. The criminal justice system, which I got to participate in for many years, I got to be a federal prosecutor at the Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit for a decade, working sex and labor trafficking cases all across this country. And I can tell you that going through the criminal justice system itself can be challenging for a survivor. We need to make sure that we have a trauma-informed and victim-centered approach to how we conduct investigations and prosecutions, and have a collaborative approach as we do it. It might mean simple things like allowing a victim to appear in court under a pseudonym, or maybe they appear in the judge's chambers, or they don't have to look directly at the trafficker as he or she glares at them. We can come up with victim-centered ways to make sure that victims are protected while their traffickers are being prosecuted. We can also think about how we can protect victims from being prosecuted. I am so concerned that you are more likely to get arrested as a trafficking victim than as a trafficker. Over and over again, we see survivors of trafficking being prosecuted for the unlawful acts their trafficker compelled them to engage in. They lack the intent to commit the crime. The elements are not made, and yet they're the ones to suffer the criminal penalty. This must stop. It makes sense why the traffickers do it. Because traffickers bear 0% of the risk of getting caught. They send their victims out to commit crimes, whether it's crimes like solicitation or prostitution, or it's identity theft or drug crimes, whether it's assault and violent crimes. Sometimes having one victim assault another victim is a method of punishment and another means of control. But if they're being coerced, they lack the intent to commit those crimes, and they should never be prosecuted for them. We have to make good on our promise about non-penalization of victims. If anyone needs to be scared of the police or being arrested, it must be the traffickers and not the victims. And if we meet survivors who have criminal records that they do not deserve, we need to move swiftly to vacate those convictions and expunge their record. They do not need to walk around with a scarlet letter that says convict or felon on their chest that prevents them from getting housing or slows down their ability to get jobs. These are some of the things in terms of what we're protecting them from. Sometimes we also need to protect them from well-intentioned nonprofit organizations. I say well-intentioned because I think sometimes organizations that are helping victims also cause them some pain. We need to make sure that they're not being exploited again in brochures or asked to tell their story repeatedly, which just can re-traumatize them. And instead of asking survivors always to tell their stories, perhaps we ask them for their opinions about how we can do better. So we talked about why we protect them, what we're protecting them from. How about how we can do better at this? I think there's a number of ways. First, from a protection standpoint, I think we need to think about how we protect victims, how we can provide comprehensive survivor services that are individually tailored to a victim's needs. This is different than the way that we have done philanthropy, the way that we have done international development. We ask organizations to build programs, and then we ask them to fit survivors into those programs. When I lived in India for several years working forced labor cases, during those 3 years that my family and I were there, we met so many folks who would come in and say, we're going to establish a sewing center for all the rescued victims, not thinking about whether everybody who's rescued wants to be a seamstress. Like, it's a good program, but it's not a one-size-fits-all. And we can't keep shoehorning survivors into our grant-driven programs. We need to create individualized care plans for each survivor and figure out what they need. Some may need shelters. Some may need short-term shelters, other long-term. Some have addictions, some don't. Some need to go home, and for others, going home is the worst possible idea because home's not safe. There was a report done last year about the human trafficking cases done on the federal level. Stunningly, it said 34% of the victims, their relationship to their trafficker was familial. That is, 34% of the traffickers were trafficking someone that they had a familial relationship with. This reflexive idea that we just need to get everyone to go home may not be a good idea. Others need job training and skills. Some need education, but some already have it. Some need counseling. But there's trauma to deal with, and we have to think about every person is going to respond to trauma differently. They're going to have their own personalities, their own ideas about what they want to go do next. And we need to free them up to make their own choices. They get to decide what they're going to do. And their success as survivors is not dependent on whether they check all the boxes of our survivor programs. I worked one case where the survivor, after she was rescued, while her trafficker was being prosecuted, I kid you not, she joined a circus and she traveled around. The FBI agent that I was working with was like, I didn't join the FBI to follow a circus around. I'm like, totally follow the circus around. So we would fly from city to city. We'd eat funnel cake and listen to her story. It was amazing, but she was free to make her own choice, even if her choice was inconvenient for us. We need to think about how we can design things for the long term. I think we can also ask ourselves about how does survivor leadership look in this movement? How can we elevate the role of survivors as we listen to their opinions and ask them to participate in the design of our programs, to participate in training law enforcement and helping us understand? One significant step in this direction is the U.S. Advisory Council on Trafficking in Persons. It's a group of survivors from both labor and sex, folks who are boys as well as young girls when they were exploited, and others who were adults when they were exploited. Some are citizens, some are non-citizens, and they've been appointed by the President of the United States to advise the federal government on how it can do a better job stopping traffickers, protecting victims, and dismantling the systems that allow traffickers to flourish. We can continue on state level, on local level, to draw in survivor leaders and make sure that when survivors no longer want to be leaders, that they're free to do that too. I have a good friend who's a survivor. She's an attorney, and she doesn't tell anybody that she's a survivor. She's decided for herself that she doesn't want to be a survivor attorney. She just wants to be a really good lawyer. Others want to be accountants. Others want to do other things. Some want to come into the space for a season. Others want to stay into it for a long time. And they need to be free to make that choice. You know, as we think about how to engage in this work, I want to encourage you that every year the State Department puts out its annual Trafficking in Persons report. This report that I get to be a part of and lead the team that does, we evaluate 187 countries around the world around this 3P paradigm. What are they doing to protect? What are they doing to prosecute? And what are they doing to prevent? You all can be a part of that because in addition to these 187 countries around the world, we rank the United States. We give a narrative about how the United States is doing, and I would invite you to contribute to that, to send in information about what the United States is doing well. Hopefully there's some good stories, but also what we need to do differently, how we need to improve. The information you give could be critically important, and so I invite you to participate with us as we draft that. I'll also encourage you to stay connected with our office. You know, follow us. We put out content all the time about new and updated information. You can follow the Trafficking Office. I think the links are on the screen, and myself. We want to be connected. We want to be available. We want to hear your thoughts and ideas. You know, as I close, I want to end with this idea of hope. You know, I think this sense of trafficking can just be overwhelming. This idea that there's 24.9 million victims around the world, more today than ever before in human history. That can cause a lot of people to feel like, you know, I'm aware of the problem, but I don't know what I'm supposed to go do. I had one gentleman say, please don't tell me another story about a 13-year-old girl in a Mumbai brothel. I've been made aware. But what am I supposed to do with all of that? You know, I think people of goodwill want to draw near to pain if they believe there's hope that something can change, something that can be done. And so let me suggest two arguments for hope. The first is that trafficking is not inevitable. Trafficking is not a naturally occurring phenomenon. It is not like a weather pattern. It's not like a scourge. It's not a disembodied menace that is affecting the populace. Trafficking happens because people choose to commit this economic crime against the vulnerable. When I think about viruses and bacteria, they affect the poor and they affect the vulnerable disproportionately. But viruses and bacteria, they're not conspiring with each other about who to infect and who to get sick and then try to prevent medical professionals from rendering aid. But traffickers are doing those very things. They are plotting about who to go target, who to exploit, and then they're trying to prevent social workers and police officers from coming and rendering the aid and support they need. I was down in Haiti seeing the effects of the earthquake after 2010. We were bringing in tarps and water and kerosene. We were trying to mitigate the adverse consequences of the earthquake. But none of us were thinking about how we could stop earthquakes. We don't know how to prevent tectonic plates from shifting. But we do know how to stop traffickers, and we're not left just to mitigate the adverse consequences of trafficking. We can actually work to stop it by stopping the people who choose to commit this crime. It's not inevitable. There is a good reason for hope. Another argument from hope comes from history. You know, if you think about the span of history, we have 4,000 years of recorded history. And since the very beginning, it's involved human trafficking. It's been called different names. It's been given different terms throughout history, from the Incas, the Mayas, the Aztecs, the Romans, the Greeks, the Hebrews, Chinese, India. Everywhere there's been some sort of human trafficking. It's been culturally accepted, it's been religiously endorsed, and it's been legally approved. It's been democratically approved. It's in our Constitution in 3 places. So if you think about that middle school sort of timeline of history, when you map it all out on a timeline, you've got 4,000 years where trafficking was accepted. And then in the last 220 years, there's been a big change. About 220 years ago, one by one, countries began to pass laws that said the slave trade was illegal and that the slaves should be emancipated. One by one, and now, today, every single country in the world has a law against human trafficking. Some are better than others, but there's a law everywhere. And the leaders of every world religion have come together to say that their sacred texts no longer support human trafficking. We're at a massive hinge of history. 4,000 years of acceptance, and just this last 200 years where it's been declared illegal. And we should celebrate the great diplomats and parliamentarians and congresspeople who made that happen. Getting us to this grand consensus is a massive historic marker. But now, upon this hinge of history, the question for our generation is, are we going to push the door of freedom wide? Now we need to take those parchment protections of law and extend them to the people they were intended to protect. Our problem today is not getting consensus that trafficking is wrong. It's implementing those laws. It's building a delivery system of justice that actually meets survivors where they are. It's building a delivery system of service protections that actually gets to the heart of what survivors need. Implementation is the challenge for this generation. The survivors I've gotten to know, they are not crying out for another UN resolution. They're not desperately pleading for another sense of Congress about what should be done. They want their pain to stop. And we get to be the people that step into that gap, declare that they have value, understanding that they have inherent value, that they were indeed endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among those was the right to liberty or freedom. It's true in our founding documents, it's true in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and what we need to do is to make that a reality for the victims. There is so much reason for hope. This is a fantastic time to be alive, a fantastic time to be in this movement. Never before have we understood the problem with such clarity. Never before have we had such information moving back and forth around the world so quickly that we're able to respond quickly. And never before have we had the resources necessary to make a difference. The question is going to be one of will. Do we choose to do it? And you all have chosen to show up here today in a step in that direction. And for that, I applaud you. Please stay in touch. I look forward to working with you. Thank you so much.